Hello, hello, and welcome to another great PowerPoint by yours truly, Mrs. McGrath. This time around, we are in period 7, so that is 1890 to 1945, and we are going to be looking at the Progressive Era. Remember, the Progressive Era is a continuation of the populist movement started by the farmers, and then it takes hold in the cities, and we see the cities start to really be the ground zero, if you will, of Progressive Era reform. Of course, the focus on this PowerPoint will be on Teddy Roosevelt, really as the first modern president. So we're going to get started. What you guys see here as 1790 to 1945, an increasingly pluralistic U.S. found problems globally, domestically, and we continue to choose to debate what is our role in regards to the government, in regards to domestic policy, and of course, later on, as we get to the world wars, what is our role internationally? This PowerPoint is going to focus on really expanding the opportunities economically and civically for many Americans. So it's really taking the Gilded Age and giving more of a fair share to the workers who helped establish it. With this particular quote, as said by Theodore Roosevelt, great thoughts speak only to a thoughtful mind, but great actions speak to all mankind. This quote, at least with my interpretation of this quote, really shows that this is a man of action. Where we have seen presidents in the past, the president that was before Roosevelt, McKinley, really campaigning just pretty much from his home in Ohio. We have President Roosevelt more as a doer, somebody who's going to go out there, says he's going to do something, and he gets it done. And you guys can see right here, this is Mount Rushmore, and as we notice, we have Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and then of course Teddy Roosevelt's face dead smack in the middle. So what does that say about him and his legacy? And how does he rate alongside these great presidents? So just some TR tidbits, just some fun facts about Teddy Roosevelt, who was born October 27, 1858, died January 6, 1919 at the age of 60. And I think a quote that really embodies the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt: death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight. I think that sums it up pretty good, since many of the pictures that we see of Teddy Roosevelt usually is with him with some sort of weapon, political cartoons of him fighting against the monopolies, against even his own political party. He suffers some, hard times as his early 20s when he was married to Alice Hathaway Lee. She dies on February 14th, the same day in the same house as his mother, and then 2 days after his first child, Alice, was born. Marries his second wife, Edith Caro, who is a longtime friend, and they will have 5 children together. So in this image right here, you have the entire Roosevelt family from Sagamore Hill in 1903. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt right there, his wife Edith, and the rest of the children. A nice presidential portrait, again, kind of showing that while also being wealthy, he is a family man. And again, famous name. You have the fact that he's related to FDR, obviously also Eleanor Roosevelt, and he's, this whole family line of presidents being related. And then right here, this is the Lincoln Memorial as the president's body was being brought through New York City after the assassination. And right in the corner right up here is little Teddy Roosevelt and Edith Caro. Remember, I said that they had been, friends for some time. So they're actually hanging out the window watching the presidential funeral procession. Okay, so in 1882, he was the youngest elected to the New York State Assembly as a Republican. So that has something going for him. This is somebody who also wrote a definitive collection of the naval battles that took place during the War of 1812 when he was 21. He was a wrestler at Harvard. He did a lot. So he was head of the New York City Police Commission. He actually helped the police officers better uniforms, exercise regimens, everything to, in the name of keeping the people safe. In 1897, he becomes the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he will leave that position to form the Rough Riders and charge up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. Comes back a war hero, becomes governor of New York State, which actually angers many of the people in the political machines of Tammany Hall. And they try to kick him out, and they push him into pretty much what is considered a do-nothing position, the vice presidency, but lo and behold, McKinley will be assassinated, and then that damn cowboy, as they call him, will assume the presidency in 1901, becoming the youngest serving president. So the square deal. This is the major aspects that you need to know for both the AP exam and the Regents exam. So we have Roosevelt believing he is a steward of the people. So with this idea of the square deal is this domestic program. It's based on what's known the 3 C's. There's another way to think about it, and I'll give that to you towards the end of the PowerPoint. But conservation, controlling those corporations, and really looking out for the consumer. And we see that a lot within many of the legislation of presidents later on. Most notably, of course, his relative, FDR, with the New Deal, and the continuation of that during the Great Society, which is a policy that we touched on in the beginning of the year. But really looking at Teddy Roosevelt, he is the leader. The buck stops here with Roosevelt. He saw his job as being the stewardship. And as I put right here, leading the nation based on public interest, as manager style, supervising everything. And then he takes his idea and says, look, I'm going to read the Constitution the way I want to read it. And that the presidency had powers that weren't specifically denied to him. So if we recall from when we talked about the Federalists versus the Democrat-Republicans, the Federalists had that ability to look at the Constitution with a broad interpretation. So we have Roosevelt doing the same thing. I can do it as long as the Constitution says I can't. So that's counter to individuals that we see later on as Jefferson, at least early on, with his strict interpretation of the Constitution, and we know he changes that philosophy. So working with labor. This is something that was talked about early on. We have many strikes that are happening within this time period as we're in the industrial age. And one of the major strikes that will eventually be handled through arbitration is the anthracite coal miner strike. These guys want to go on strike working in the coal mines, very dangerous, long hours, horrible conditions, awful pay. But what we know about the coal miner strike is that this is taking place in November. And what happens in November is that we are aware the weather turns bad, it gets cold. We have railroads that are running on coal, you still have steamships being used. If these coal miners go on strike, it could lead to a national security issue. So Roosevelt, in that stewardship mentality, takes the helm, and is the first time we really see the executive branch and the federal government in general try to actually arbitrate and work with the strikers instead of collectively always working with the big businesses. So this word right here, arbitration, really important word. Independent person coming in and really trying to settle dispute as a compromiser. So he intervenes on behalf of public safety and the workers, and really this is seen as a win for labor, because in the end the striking workers will get a pay increase and we'll see a 9-hour workday. So win for labor, and that's where we see Roosevelt start to get that persona that he will be willing to take down big businesses if they go against the public good. A second act that is part of the square deal is the Employers' Responsibility Act. You have insurance for workers, especially on interstate railroads. Again, another very dangerous job. So when people get hurt, there's some responsibility given to the factories or the owners, in this case for the railroads, to take care and have some responsibility for those who have been injured. So images like this right here, the American Hercules. If you know anything about Hercules, the idea of the strength and willingness to take down the enemy, many cartoons of this time period have Teddy Roosevelt really because he was known as a wrestler as well, you know, picking fights and doing what is necessary. All right, so next we have Teddy Roosevelt as a trust buster. And yes, this is a real picture of him as a wrestler at Harvard. You have the Elkins Act in 1901. You cannot give rebates to special corporations. So who was infamous, if you remember, from receiving these special rebates? It would be Standard Oil. The Standard Oil is a big fish monopoly that everybody wants to get rid of. And Roosevelt's going to attempt to do that, but it will be his predecessor, William Taft, that will have the ability and the legal know-how to really take down Standard Oil. The second act is the Hepburn Act. This is going to increase the power of the ICC. If you don't know what the ICC is, this is the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Commission was set up in 1887 to try to regulate the railroads and try to prevent the exploitation of the farmers and charging more for short haul versus a long haul. So this was put into place in the 1880s, but it doesn't have any ability, it has no teeth to actually do anything. So with the Hepburn Act, that gives them the authority to fix maximum rates, set them up within the ferries, railroads, bridges, all of this being infrastructure, all right, and interstate commerce. So it gives the government more ability to regulate them. They also put limits on shipping costs as well. If you click here, I put down in the comments the video links that you can look at. This is, in this particular picture here, it's a cartoon from like the 2000s called Hysteria, and it's a song about Teddy Roosevelt as a trust buster to the Ghostbusters theme. If you're interested in watching it, you can click in the comments below. But TR had a policy. He didn't want to eliminate all trusts or all monopolies. He looked at some of them actually being good for America, good for the consumer, and then some not so good. So again, many of the political commentators at the time would draw Teddy Roosevelt as the hunter when he went into the Badlands in the 1880s after his wife and mother died. And he tried to, tame the Wild West. He also tries to tame the monopolies. And a few of those cases that tend to show up on exams, both Regents and AP, are the Northern Securities case. This was one of the railroad cases in regards to it was controlled by Vanderbilt. And this company had a complete monopoly using pooling within the Northwest to have really high rates. Teddy Roosevelt, along with the Justice Department, which is a legal arm of the executive branch, said that the Northern Securities Railroad violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Again, another term that is super important that if you don't know, you should be looking this one up. Just real quick, the Sherman Antitrust Act, I believe, was in the last PowerPoint. The Sherman Antitrust Act, established in 1890, prevented the illegal combination of businesses into trusts or monopolies because it was seen as an unfair business practice. Remember, when a monopoly is created, consumers can only get the product from one particular or a few particular businesses. And when they do that, they can increase the cost of the product, thus hurting the consumer. Sherman Antitrust Act tried to stop that. Again, remember, the Sherman Antitrust Act was also used against the labor unions at the time. So with the Sherman Antitrust Act, Roosevelt pretty much sees these are laws that are on the books. We should be using them and using them within the scope of the Supreme Court against big business. So the Supreme Court, remember, as the interpreter of the Constitution and the laws within the United States, agrees that the Northern Security case was a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, so this monopoly is resolved or dissolved. The Swift beef case, yes, there was a monopoly on beef. There was a beef trust. And as we know from reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, the beef industry is a big problem. So under the Sherman Antitrust Act, again, this company is going to be dissolved as well. And then we see even more with regulating the food industry, because that's something that people deal with on an everyday basis. So in the end, Teddy Roosevelt will break up 44 trusts. it will be Taft that's the next step within the consumer protection is the Meat Inspection Act. And again, there are links to video clips, real quick ones right here. This one deals with Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and this one is a quick snippet of Food Inc. Many of you have probably seen it in health class, but the idea, the compare and contrast of the modern muckraker, the modern attitude towards what we're eating. Of course, you guys understand the movement back to more of an organic lifestyle, and how the FDA and the food corporations really play a role in that. But with the Meat Inspection Act, you're going to have federal agents inspect the meats that will be shipped across state lines. If it stays in the state, that is a state or delegated or reserved right, I should say, for the state. But once it crosses state lines, the federal government is in control. Now, the biggest thing for conservation with Teddy Roosevelt is that he's kind of an anomaly. He was somebody who liked to hunt and kill things, yet he was big into conservation. Many of the things, animals that he shot once he leaves the presidency and, has these animals that he sees all around the world will be shipped back to the Smithsonian. So because of Teddy Roosevelt, some of the things that you will see at these museums are because of him. So really you have him as your first environmental president. Right here, this is an image right in the corner down here with John Muir. It's a water buffalo that he killed out in Africa. And this picture right here is just, that's a Brooks Brothers uniform. And he is not outside, he's modeling in that picture. So look at that. So conservation, preserving land, we know the environmental impact. Starting in 1891 when he is not president, but when we start to see him pick up the pace, he's going to use these acts that are on the books to put forth millions and millions of acres of land under federal protection. So they're there for the long haul. We see as industrialization continues to happen, more and more land is going to be gobbled up by corporate America. So we have the Newlands Reclamation Act in 1902, money to build dams to help irrigation systems, especially in the South and in the West. The Forest Service Act in 1905, managing the water and timber. His appointee, Gifford Pinchot, is going to be at the helm of controversy when we get to the Taft administration, and he will be fired by Taft, which is going to create a big rift between Teddy Roosevelt and President Taft. Lo and behold, millions of acres will be established. You have Yosemite Park, Yellowstone Park, and the Grand Canyon, all thanks to the policy set up by the progressives and Teddy Roosevelt. And the idea to waste, to destroy our natural resources, to skin and exhaust the land instead of using it so as to increase its usefulness, will result in undermining the days of our children, the very prosperity which we ought by right to hand down to them. So keep this stuff going for generations and generations. It's really part of the national identity that we started to create and cultivate during the Jacksonian period with the romanticism that we see with the Hudson River School of Art, things of that nature. He's saying we should be keeping that. These two images right here, this is where we see the negative side of Teddy Roosevelt. We know a lot about Andrew Jackson, the idea that he vetoed, that he usurped his power, that he trampled over the Constitution. And what we see with this image is pretty much a similar within the two. We know that, historically speaking, Americans are not fans of kings, and we see the veto here, the sword and the scepter here, the crown, and again, the tattered Constitution. In this particular image, we have a play possibly on another famous leader within France, but this is, now forgive my French, but it's "L'État c'est moi." What does that mean? This translates into "I am the state." And if we notice right here, he is crowning himself. What does that say about his power? We have the scepter to rule and the sword as a military aspect. What is this saying about Roosevelt, and what does the public view him as? Is this a positive or a negative? Other interesting facts, you guys can check this out on your own. The teddy bear is named after him. He was a boxer, wrestler, hunter, all these other things. He invited a prominent boxer, John Sullivan, I believe, to the White House for a boxing match, and in process, the guy hit him so hard that he suffered a detached retina and was considered legally blind in that eye. And of course, most famously, the bullet that was in his rib cage during the 1912 election, where he went on a speaking tour for the Bull Moose, also known as the Progressive Party, and he was shot and then spoke, of course, for 90 minutes, a famous poster that I have hanging in my room somewhere, where he went on for 90 minutes while he was bleeding to give his speech. It shows such. So, an easy way to remember how the Square Deal was important. Remember, we have Teddy Roosevelt looking at his presidency as the supervisor of the country. So the easy way to remember Square Deal, you can remember the 3 C's, but what I like to say is that Teddy Roosevelt was giving some loving to the country. So TLC squared. And that's Teddy Roosevelt with his granddaughter right there. Lovingly cute little picture. T for the trust buster, as he broke up 44 trusts. The L, working with labor in an argument. He loves labor, perhaps. I don't know. And then the C being the consumer protection and conservation. So TLC squared. All right, quickly here we have William Taft, more conservative, wanted to keep the status quo. He did not have the loud, charismatic personality that Teddy Roosevelt had. He was more of a conservative, what we would consider today more of a true conservative president. But he does get a lot of things done, and he doesn't necessarily get credit for some of this stuff. But we have the continuation of some policies with the Mann-Elkins Act, giving the ICC even more power now to regulate communications, telephone and telegraph. The big one, the 16th Amendment right here, which we talked about earlier, the idea of an imposed graduated income tax. The more money you make, the more money you have to pay in taxes. Now, tariffs are a major issue. Now, as we know, tariffs are taxes on goods coming into the country. We did want to lower those tariffs so we can be more competitive overseas with other European businesses. So they wanted tariffs lowered, but Congress eventually raises them. Now, the problem here is that lowering tariffs was part of the Republican platform that Roosevelt and then eventually Taft pushed for. But instead, they're going to be raised with the Payne-Aldrich Act. Now, of course, these are names for the congressmen that sponsored the bill. And with that, he says this is one of the greatest, acts put into place. And now he kind of seems as somebody who's not trustworthy. If you run on the platform of I'm going to lower tariffs, and then in turn you raise them, people start to distrust you. So the Republican Party will split, and you have a faction that is conservative, that is kind of old school. They're going to support Taft. And then you have the more progressive faction led by Teddy Roosevelt. What you see here is when you have a Republican Party that's split, it makes way for Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency in 1913. And we know Taft's claim to fame, the bathtub story, which technically isn't exactly true. You can look up that. All right, so number one, the one thing that always gets me with Woodrow Wilson is that you guys can see right here, his teeth are awful. That is a sign of a stroke when you have bad teeth hygiene like that. But we'll save that for another day. So Woodrow Wilson runs on the platform of new freedom. And this is where we start to see every president starts to give their legislation, especially their domestic policy, a name. So with Roosevelt, we have Square Deal. With Wilson, New Freedom. We're going to see, of course, New Deal with FDR. The New Frontier with JFK. Great Society with LBJ. And New Federalism with Nixon, and it continues on New Federalism also with Reagan. Of course, you have the policies of Obamacare, things of that nature. They all have their name associated with their policies. So with Wilson, he's going to aim to really push for more competition because that's going to help with the consumer, and he's going to enforce, of course, the antitrust legislation. So we have the Underwood Tariff passed in 1913, lowering tariffs again, which is something that Taft wanted to do. We could not get that. And then again, more of a graduated income tax. And then the big one, the Federal Reserve System. This is super important. Dividing the nation's banking system into these 12 districts and giving this Federal Reserve oversight to make sure that the banks are on the up and up, that they're doing the correct thing. And so we actually have an oversight or bureaucratic oversight committee in the Federal Reserve that really controls the money supply, so we don't go into these panics and depression that we were seeing in the 1870s and 90s. So with new freedom, the Clayton Antitrust Act is going to be signed into law in 1914, giving the government even more power to control businesses. We have prohibition, but prohibiting companies from price fixing and then buying all the stock in competing firms, which is something that the Rockefeller and Standard Oil Company were notorious for. As a side note, in 1911, the Standard Oil Company was sued by the federal government under President Taft, and it's the Taft administration that is able to dissolve Standard Oil. In the end, Taft at least broke up 90 trusts. And then, of course, later on, for Wilson, not somebody who actually supported suffrage, but nonetheless, the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, happening after the First World War.